Okay, our next session will be a fireside chat about the University of the Future. With us, we have Ben Nelson, Chairman and CEO at Minerva Project, and next to him, Manuel Muñiz, Provost of IE University and Dean of the IE School of Global and Public Affairs. Please, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you, and I want to thank Ben also for being here. It's a fireside chat without a fireside, but it will be a chat. I think that
we'll try to generate the fire.
we'll generate the fire on a discussion on the future of higher education. Ben is the founder and the chairman of Minerva University, and it's a fascinating project. So I think we're very lucky, and we're grateful that you are here and that you've come all the way from California to spend some time with us. And I know a little bit about Minerva. Thanks a lot. Thanks to the conversations that we've been having. But could you tell the folks here in the room what led you to the creation of Minerva, and why is Minerva different? Why does it plug a hole in the higher ed landscape?
Sure. So first, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And maybe the easiest way of understanding Minerva and why we exist is to really think about what is the mission of a university. And there are varying arguments about what the mission of a university is, but one of the common refrains that we hear is that a university's job is to create and disseminate knowledge. And unfortunately, at least for half of that mission, if that is the mission of the modern university, then we're in big trouble. Because the creation of knowledge, there is an argument, yes, the university is going to have a research function and it needs to continue to push the boundaries of knowledge, but the dissemination of knowledge, boy, the concept that disseminating knowledge is best done by a professor standing in front of a 200-person lecture hall and then speaking that knowledge out loud seems a little bit antiquated. And of course, in the world before the printing press, let alone the internet, that made sense. But for those individuals who are trying to rethink what a university's mission is in a modern world, and that really started in a series of conversations and actions in the old British colonies in North America in the middle of the 18th century, about what is the role of a university in a modern world, in a world where you don't train individuals to be subjects of a king or subordinate to a church, but actually to be able to pursue varying careers during their own lifetimes, where they could be a merchant one day and a diplomat another day, or be a farmer one day and a judge another day, or be a doctor one day and then maybe a head of state. And all of a sudden, that conception of a new world meant that they needed to rethink what an education is and really focus it, as some of the founding fathers in the United States talked about, on practical or useful information, being able to learn what to do with what you learn, as opposed to really just absorb information. And unfortunately, that view of an education, a view that an education is really there for you to use as opposed to just remember and pass an exam, lost. And effectively, universities around the world, some that had never adopted or never even thought about this type of approach, and others that considered it, even tried it for a few decades and then gave up, has, in my opinion, caused a lot of problems. And in fact, 30 years ago, when I was starting my undergraduate studies myself, I created a bizarre hypothesis, a hypothesis that those individuals educated in the new system, which I define as roughly occurring in after 1968, 1970, that period, that once they would take over various sectors of government, private enterprise, et cetera, we would see a cross-sector collapse around the world. And of course, at the time, 30 years ago, we just won the Cold War. It was a rise of liberal democracy all over the world. We had won. Everything was great. People thought I was out of my mind. Unfortunately, today, very few people think I'm out of my mind. And that is primarily because the world, largely due to globalization, automation, introduction of computers, the internet, et cetera, has moved increasingly faster. It's become increasingly more complex, and our education system has not kept up. Sure. And so Minerva was really built to address that.
One of the things that we've been looking at, so at IE University, we're also quite obsessed by this discussion, by this debate. What is the function of universities in a world that is changing as quickly as the world around us, and also in a world where information and the value of information and the value of information arbitrage has plummeted, right? It has almost disappeared. In fact, this is a trend across sectors in the digital space. So, businesses that were built on the arbitrage of information and under very severe pressure to continue operating, whether it's translation services, travel agencies, financial services. I mean, this is one of the effects of digitalization. So if information is readily available, and it is, to a large extent, you can access a lot of information, to some extent now even structured in courses, in programs online. If universities think that they're in the business of transferring information, then they're going to go bust, right? Exactly. We should be doing something else. And I wanted to ask you, we have an answer at IE about this, or the beginning of an answer, which is, we're there to do other things. We're there to provide skills, soft skills. We're there to build an experience for our students, because you also learn through experience. We're there to build networks and to help them connect with colleagues, both in the classroom, but also with outside of the classroom. So we need to make these spaces much more porous. It's very tough to do that when you're designing your own learning pathway at home by yourself. So they're truly unique things. We're there to build a pathway of learning for them, to curate a learning pathway, which is very tough to do when you're on your own. So there are lots of things there that are still specific and that we can do in a way that will enhance the creation and dissemination of knowledge, not of information. But I know Minerva has perhaps an even more radical answer to this question, which is, if we're not there just to have people sit down and just, sort of lecture them, top down, and have them retain these pieces of information. What are universities there for? And I know you guys have come up with a fascinating answer, and it's there in your pedagogy and in your classrooms. And it's kind of great that somebody is actually deploying a model that is different.
Yeah, I'll give an interesting example, because as you were talking about the arbitrage of information, what's fascinating to me is I think the world is really begging for an arbitrage of analytics. I'll give you a favorite example. I've never actually related this to education, but I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. If you were to go talk to almost any professional investor and ask them, what is the one strategy that guarantees better than market returns if you look at it historically? Most professional investors will say, it's contrarian investing. Contrarians have historically, over most periods of time, over the past 120 some years, have outperformed the market. Great. What kind of investor are you? Non-contrarian. And it's fascinating because the vast majority of investors, of course, are not contrarian, yet they know intellectually that being a contrarian investor is indeed the right approach. It's the safest approach. So why? Why is it that even when you know the answer, you don't put it into execution? Well, of course, there's myriads of issues. First and foremost, just being a contrarian investor isn't going to guarantee success. You have to have a theory as to why something is going to occur that the rest of the market isn't seeing. So you have to have an analytical framework to be able to deploy. It takes courage, personal courage, in your analytics to believe in your analytical framework and ignore the herd that is telling you to do something different. It is important to understand that when you actually deploy something, you are going to get criticized, that there are going to be short-term signals that may be contrary to long-term returns, right? And you're going to have to withstand that. And so you have characters, you have analytics, you have courage, you have confidence, right? You have the ability to communicate what you're doing and set the right expectations, to understand constraints. All of a sudden, you see all of these other characteristics that are crucial in order to enable you to be a contrarian investor that live outside of just making an investment decision. And ultimately, a university's job, a job of an institution that trains a person to be successful in life, is not only to be clear about each of those elements, but most importantly, to train a student to be able to apply them in novel situations. And the Minerva curricular and pedagogical model is not only to name those core lenses through which you can view the world in an analytical framework in a more effective way, but more importantly, to give the students the opportunities year after year, course after course, experience after experience. You talked about the learning experience outside of a classroom, to be able to apply those tools and get feedback on how they apply them, not just if they do it well or not well, but to ensure that they can do it in all of these different types of applications along all sorts of different dimensions of application.
So can you run us through, and I have another issue that I'll raise after, because it's another big challenge that we see that we need to face and as institutions, which is the very rapid change of social and technological change. But before we go there, can you tell us a little bit how a day in the life of a Minerva student might look like, right? So imagine you're a student there, you wake up. How does that look? And how does this issue, because this idea of in the class, you're not teaching content, so you're not teaching, the history of, the 1800s in continental Europe, but you're extracting lessons from history that you can then apply to other historical periods, or you're extracting lessons, methodologies, these lenses of knowledge from political science or for economic theory or others, and you're applying them to other cases. So you're learning the methods of decision making. You're not learning the substance exclusively, right, the content of events, but rather how to address challenges and decision making. So it's very radical, in fact. It's very radical because what you're essentially saying is screw the content, right? The content they can access somewhere else. They don't need to memorize the names of the U.S. presidents or the Visigoth kings in Spain. What they need to know is what we've learned systematically, theoretically, sort of mechanically through these processes, so that they apply it to new cases. So how does that look on a day of a student there?
Yeah, so putting that into practice means that a student needs to devote a significant amount of time on their training of their mind. And so before the student comes into class, they are going to spend quite a lot of time reading, analyzing, often writing, getting prepared for what is going to be asked of them in class. And the best part is they're not quite sure what's going to be asked of them in class, because a good Minerva class won't ask them about what the reading said. It'll ask them to take lessons out of the reading and then apply them to something they haven't encountered before, right? It's, again, that ability to transfer. And so there's a lot of preparation. A student learns how to read, meaning this may sound strange because you think, oh, doesn't everybody know how to read? No, most people don't know how to read. How to actually look in between the lines, see patterns in what is the reading, such that they can then apply those lessons. We highlight some of those areas. Watch out for this as you read, look for that. And we train their ability to notice those things themselves. They then go into a classroom environment, but that classroom environment doesn't involve them leaving their room. All of our students live together in a building, a residence hall that we operate, but their classes are all done online. And that's a little bit strange because before the pandemic, we're the only residential university in the world where all of our students live together and all of their classes weren't, quote unquote, in person. And that's because they enter a digital learning environment where there's a 1 camera to 1 face ratio. They're online at all times. And during class, the professor barely speaks. In fact, they're not allowed to speak for more than 3 or 4 minutes at a time. They rarely speak that much. But they call on students and facilitate their applications. First, by when they come into class, they are asked a question about applying what they've read or how they're prepared to some new context or some overall lesson from it. And then get asked perhaps a poll question, they have a debate, they go into breakout groups, they work on something, they may bring those worksheets back from the breakout groups into the main classroom area, they will do a simulation, they'll do a reflection at the end, and an hour and a half long class goes by instantly because the students are deeply processing what they're doing, and they're always kept using a number of techniques that we've built into the environment at the edge of their seat. Mm-hmm. Now, after class, they prepare, of course, for the following day's class, but then they also have to apply what they've learned to their day-to-day. Because unlike most institutions that have a campus environment, our students live in a residence hall in the middle of one of the world's great cities. And I say one because they spend their first year living in San Francisco, and then they spend the next 3 years living in 6 other cities, traveling together as a group, learning how to navigate different cultures, different contexts, and applying their formal learning into real-world situations, both informally, going to market, shopping for their food, learning how to cook, manage their finances in all those locations, and formally, where we engage local governments, businesses, nonprofit organizations in civic projects that the students apply their learning to on a day-to-day. And so it's a very intense, very academic and real-world type of experience. Mm-hmm.
The degrees they get at the end, these are bachelor's degrees in specific areas, or?
Yeah, they can get a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science, depending on what they study. We have degrees in business and computational science, arts and humanities, social science, natural science. But underneath that, all of what we teach is highly cross-disciplinary. Sure. And so, for example, a student in our business program won't just study finance or marketing or management. They'll study brand management, or they'll study how to be effectively a CFO of a company, how to allocate capital, or how to be a chief operating officer, or they'll study how to be a startup CEO, or a growth company CEO, or a mature company CEO, and deal with real-world types of applications in their approach. Or, for example, in natural sciences, they won't just study biology or chemistry or physics. They'll study the world of atoms and molecules, or the world of cells and organisms, or the world of planetary systems. Mm-hmm. And you apply biology, chemistry, and physics as necessary to each.
To these. I was telling Ben before that this reminded me a lot to a course that I used to run when I was a graduate student in the UK on the big principles of political science. So political science over the years has been producing these very important theoretical insights into how institutions function, states function, so things like principal-agent problems, institutional biases. Institutional biases are the dynamics of very large institutions, like, say, ministries or cities or states. So we have a lot of insights that are theoretical, and the Minerva method to this would be to take those and then apply them to very different cases: educational reform in Kenya, or healthcare management in France. But the theory and the lens would be the same, but you would be applying it to very different circumstances.
That's my favorite concentration at Minerva. It's called Designing Societies.
Is that so? This course was extremely popular, very tough to teach. We chose about 12 insights from political science. One that I mentioned before was the tragedy of the global commons, which is, it's a very well-known concept in political science, which is that every individual has a doesn't have a particularly strong incentive to take care of the global commons, say climate. So each of us are making individual decisions that are leading to the damage, of the global common, which is the climate. So you need to learn this, and then you can apply it to different things, to global trade, to global security, to other issues, even to business issues. So the importance thing, and I think this is what is deep about your methodology, which is right at the DNA. Some institutions might have a program here, a course there, but for you, is the founding principle of the institution is that it's in fact the tool that is important, and you can apply it then to different circumstances, and that's the learning. The learning is to learn how to think, right, and how to make the right decisions. We have 1 minute and 43 seconds, but I cannot resist but asking a final question on this. Something that really, really has led us to deep thinking about our mission, right, which is when we look at the world around us, we see a world that is changing exponentially on a whole range of metrics, from population to the generation of data. This is reflected in the labor market in an extraordinarily fast changing labor market, probably the fastest in history if you take an aggregate measure. People that we're educating today and that are going to have professional careers that are going to be 20, 30, 40 years long are going to have maybe 20, 30 job transitions throughout their careers, right? So they're going to change jobs multiple times. In the figures that we have of skill obsolescence, I don't know if you've been following this, but it's fascinating. So big HR companies, talent companies, they produce these metrics of for how long are skills and knowledge, fundamentally knowledge that you acquire through formal education, for how long are they valid? Are they useful in the labor market, in the marketplace? And that figure has come down from about 20 years on average to about 5. It depends on the discipline. So this means that what you learned on your first year of studies of digital marketing is obsolete a year after you've left your studies, because the methods have changed, the tools have changed. And this is truly impactful for how we think about what we do, right? Probably we need to be much more modular, less front-loaded, much more surgical, sort of lifelong, accompany people throughout their whole career. I think it's also a validation of your method, because if the content is king and the content becomes obsolete, then you better focus on the tools, right? Because the tools can be adapted and refitted depending on the content. But when you look at this, time's up. This is very appropriate given what I was just saying, that how quickly the world is changing. By the way, we've subjected Ben to the least Spanish day I can imagine. We had like a 45-minute lunch. Now we have a 20-minute panel. But just when you think of this issue of a fast-changing world, how do you think that should be impacting the way universities think? And we'll end on that.
Yeah. So I will actually be the contrarian in this, because of all of the trends that you talked about. You're going to have 20 plus career changes. You have related technical skills that are plummeting in their value in the long run, right? You go from 20 years to 5, etc. How can a university intervene in those transitions? What is somebody going to come back to university every 2 years to learn and then go? It doesn't make any sense. It's impossible. What you need is to think about durable skills. Because the reality is that understanding the difference between a fact and a claim was valuable 1,000 years ago. It'll be valuable 1,000 years from now, right? The ability...
This is even if you're running for president of the United States.
Especially if you're running for president. And these are, the ability to modify what you say depending on the audience that you're talking to, and take into consideration how your message lands with who's listening to you, is going to be relevant in the past. It was relevant in the past, it will be absolutely relevant in the future. Learning how to learn, which is really at the core of all of this. Learning how to work effectively with others. Learning how to analyze information, learning how to think about unintended consequences and second and third order effects. These are all things that university needs to over-index on, because if we do a good job at that, whether a student comes back to the institution to continue their education or whether they do it on their own, what we've done is we've enabled them to be successful in whatever eventuality they're going to interact with.
That's a wonderful point to end on. So thank you, everybody. Our time is up. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. you.